All right. Well, hello, hello, hello. We're super excited for this awesome town hall tonight. We were just chatting behind the scenes about what an awesome topic this is tonight. I know the Iocdf has been getting a lot of questions about values and about what it means to move towards your values and figure out what your values are and how to navigate when OCD latches onto your values. So we have a ton of content coming your way in the next 90 minutes or so. But as folks jump in, if you want to go ahead and tell us hello, feel free to tell us where you're watching from. And our question for the night to kick off is there something that you might want to share that brings you joy or that makes you smile? Is there something that brings you joy? And while we're waiting for folks to jump on, I'd love to just ask Tom, Cali, or Marisa, are there things that bring you joy? Is there something that makes you smile when you think about it?
I think for me, something that brings me joy is running. Most of the time, there are those days where I would rather not go run, especially when it's cold out. But that's just part of being human. So yeah, I think running and sunshine.
Mm-hmm. Running and sunshine. I agree with you on that, Cali.
Yeah. Definitely need more sunshine. I'm in upstate New York and it's just a lot of snow. I think for me, I mean, similar to Cali, I think it's like weightlifting, competing in weightlifting. You know, obviously I had my athletic career taken from me in high school because of OCD. And so now, you know, finding that sport in college, then starting to compete this year was a long time coming. And that definitely makes me smile and kind of, you know, coming full circle with, you know, not getting to compete in high school with all my friends and then now competing in what is now my favorite sport that I didn't realize back then. That definitely makes me smile.
I love that. Thank you, Tom. Marisa, is there something that brings you joy? Oh, I was going to say, Marisa, is there something that brings you joy or that makes you smile?
Yeah, sorry, my computer froze there for a second.
I was thinking very intently about the joy.
I couldn't see anybody or hear you. So yes, absolutely. The things that put a smile on my face are family beach time. I love being at the beach with my family, playing with my 3-year-old, hiking, camping, doing things out in nature, being adventurous with them is what's really, really important to me.
I love that. We have lots of nature folks here. I would jump on the bandwagon of being outside and running and doing all those things. And something that also brings me joy is getting to do stuff like this with the Iocdf and seeing all of you who are starting to tune in. And this is just such a gift. So hi to all of you. I see we have Mexico and Miami and New England. I see some runners in the chat. I see family and cold weather from Liz Smith, from Ethan's mom. I have hi from Michigan, hi from upstate New York, Brooklyn, New York. We have Nashville OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. So we have a great group starting to come in here from the UK. So super excited. So we'll go ahead and jump in. And I'm just going to give us a few little disclaimers, some bios for our awesome guest tonight, and then we'll jump into all of our stuff. And yes, Pablo, this is in fact live. So if anyone else is wondering, this is, well, I guess if you're watching it at 7 Eastern on March 1st, it's live. I guess if you're watching it at a later time, because this will also be recorded, it is then not live. But to Pablo's question, currently it is live. Okay. So this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can use the Iocdf's online resource directory at iocdf.org/find help to locate a trained clinician near you. It's important to note that the International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline. If you're in crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room or call 911 or the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255. It's also important to note that we want to create as safe a space as possible, and we want to be kind and respectful to everyone on the stream tonight. So this is a broadcast that's happening on several social media platforms. It's also being recorded. So please be mindful of this as you ask personal questions or leave comments. At the end of the day, this is all about creating a safe space, and it's all about just supporting one another wherever we are on this journey that is OCD and that is life. So we're really excited to dive in with some awesome folks here tonight. For any of you who are here that I don't know, I'm Katie. I always put Reverend because I'm an ordained minister, not because you actually have to call me Reverend. Katie's totally fine. I just like folks to know that ministers have OCD too, and that even folks who are clergy navigate OCD and other mental health conditions. So that's why I always put that there, but super informal. I have the pleasure of serving as a lead advocate for the Iocdf, among many other things related to faith, mental health, and faith and mental health integrative services. We also have another one of our lead advocates on here tonight, Tom Smalley, who is a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association. He's living in New York and has a master's degree in exercise and sports science from Marymount College. He was diagnosed with OCD in 2014 at the age of 16, and shortly after became passionate about spreading awareness about what OCD really is in an effort to break down the wall of stigma around the mental disorder and mental health in general. Tom was the recipient of the 2019 Iocdf Hero Award, and Tom speaks at the annual OCD conferences along with different schools around the Northeast. He has also appeared on a variety of blogs and podcasts, and he is particularly passionate about athletes and OCD and how it affects performance, along with the stigma of mental health in sports. So, Tom, we're really excited to have you here tonight, and your passion for anxiety and athletes, but also just your passion for values and for life.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Then we have Cali Warner, and we're excited to have Cali here tonight. She is an athlete also and a clinician at her new practice, Athlete Rising, which we're very excited about. Cali was just noting that this is brand new practice, and she's in the process of moving. So we're really excited she decided to make the time to still be here tonight with this important topic. She is also obtaining her PhD at Baylor University. Her research focuses on competitive athletes with debilitating anxiety that negatively impacts their performance. Her struggle with OCD began at the young age of 4, and she didn't receive appropriate treatment until she was competing as a Division I athlete at Rice University. While at Rice, Cali won 9 conference championships and was named an honorable mention All-American in the 10K. She was able to reignite the love for her sport after receiving appropriate evidence-based care. And she hopes to help others with mental illness know they are not alone and that appropriate treatment is available to reobtain the joy that mental illness takes away. Cali recently qualified and competed in the U.S. Olympic Trials Marathon in 2020 and continues to pursue her passion for running while advocating for those struggling with mental illness through her research, therapy, and her own personal testimony. And she is also the author of the children's book, Anxious Annie, which we all know and love very much as well, which really is a great thing for both adults and kids to connect with around OCD. Thanks, Katie. You're welcome. And then we have Dr. Marisa T Mazza, who is a clinical psychologist and founder of Choice Therapy Psychological Services. Dr. Mazza and her team provide evidence-based therapy and consultation via telehealth in California. Her areas of specialty include ACT, ERP, and OCD. She has published the ACT workbook for OCD, which is right over there on my bookshelf and has been super helpful in my own recovery journey, and is faculty at the University of San Francisco and Iocdf Behavioral Therapy Training Institute, the BTTI. So excited to have you here tonight as well.
Thank you for having me.
So awesome. Well, y'all, I would love to go ahead and dive in. I can see already some questions kind of starting to pop up here, and that's great. Some folks saying that, yep, a lot of folks still checking in that they're watching, but want everyone to know that we're going to dive into some questions around values first and kind of lay the groundwork for what values are, what we're going to be talking about tonight. But we would love to have you ask any questions related to values, OCD, or anything else that pops up for you throughout our time together. And we will, a little bit later, start just kind of tapping off the questions. So make sure to just go ahead and start loading them up, and we'll hit as many questions as we can in addition to our conversation. So with this big topic of determining your values, especially when OCD might latch onto your values, I would love to have us start by defining what values actually are. So Marisa, I would love, I know values is a huge passion topic for you. Do you mind sharing a little bit when we talk about values? What does that mean? What does that look like?
Sure. I get super excited to talk about this. As a therapist, I think it's one of the most rewarding things to help my clients connect with their values and also commit to them, like live them in their day to day. And defining it is a perfect place to start. So when I think of values, I think of guiding principles, deeply held wishes or desires that perhaps we have for ourselves. And they can kind of be used to guide how we live. Um, they're abstract, they're rather broad, which is in some ways helpful because they can be very flexible. And I'm sure we'll talk about why that's helpful later on, but that's kind of what I think of when I think of values.
I think that's a great place to start. Cali, do you have anything to add, or how do you think of values? If you were defining values for somebody, what would that look like?
I think culture is tied into values. So how are you culturally influenced in your life? Definitely a big part. Our values for me would mean just like I think Marisa said, some things that I'm passionate about. So just anything that ignites the spark or makes me excited to talk about it or share, or make a difference around something.
Thank you. And I wonder, just along those lines, and then we'll start to get into what this looks like more specifically, but how do values relate to the treatment for OCD? Why is that an important conversation that we might be having? Either Cali or Marisa, curious what y'all might think.
So for OCD, we know that we are supposed to be leaning towards our values and away from OCD's values. I like to say that OCD has its own, like a mind of its own, and wants to pull you away from the things that you love and are passionate about. And so if we're giving into compulsion, we're giving into our OCD. And if we're moving towards our values, we're leaning towards that big word, uncertainty. So uncertainty is scary, but it means long-term freedom, which allows you to fulfill what it is that you want in life more heavily, gearing towards values.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Go ahead, Marisa.
Love what you said, Cali. Absolutely. I think of like the more time someone spends focused on the OCD means the less time they get to spend on the things that give them purpose and meaning, their values. And so sometimes we'll talk about like what's the cost of kind of giving in to these compulsions or continuing to focus on trying to control or avoid. And often it's values.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think, I know we're going to talk about this and spend some time, but this for me was such, I think, a really a big turning point in my own journey with OCD. And I was sharing that with our folks before we got on, that I think for so many of us, as we're going through ERP and as we're going through that journey, it can seem so incredibly scary. And it can feel like, well, what's the point? And how can I possibly say maybe to all of my greatest fears? Well, I think the answer to that question becomes exactly what Cali and Marisa just said. It's your values. You're actually choosing your values over all of the things that the OCD is putting in front of you that you're afraid of. So Tom, how has this been a part of your journey? Have values come up for you? And I know that athletics has been a big component, but I wonder if this, along with other things, might have been a part of what your OCD journey looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, OCD always attacks. We always talk about it, right? It attacks everything you love and value. So like, OCD is not going to attack something that, at least I know I've learned, it's never attacking something that I won't care about and won't cause me to try to feed the OCD. So I think, between athletics, my faith, family relationships, my relationship with my girlfriend, things like that, OCD is going to attack those things because those are what I hold closest to my heart. And so I think it's been a constant battle of trying to lean into that uncertainty and those values and make sure that, I'm focused on those values and not giving into the OCD.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tom, I love that you bring that up because it can almost get a little bit confusing, which I think is some of really what our big topic is going to be tonight of, oh, how can this thing be really important to me? And how can my OCD latch on to that at the same time? And what's the push and pull? So I think in order to get there, which is kind of a big piece for us, I'd love to first just ask Cali and Marisa a little bit more about how do we determine values? I know there are some different methods that you might use with clients and things that you might do, but I think that's a question we get a lot of. What questions do we ask? How do we actually figure out if a value is a value? And are there some examples of what that might be?
You can go first, Marisa.
Sure. Okay. So there's a few different ways. There's lots of values exercises out there now. In fact, if you just Google values card sort, I'm sure you'll be able to find concrete exercises to help you identify those values. There's also questioning. So for example, the question I threw out there earlier, like what's the cost of continuing to spiral into that behavior, can sometimes touch upon people's values. Also the question of like, what is this in the service of, right? Why am I willing to take this risk? What is this in the service of, right? Why bother doing hard things unless they're truly meaningful to you? And that's really what I love about values is not only in my personal life and with my clients, I've just seen how really connecting emotionally with one's values can really help inspire them to keep living. And it can be the difference between living and surviving. It's not always easy to live our values. It's often the harder path, actually. It includes anxiety. It often will include things like obsessions and urges. And what values can look like, some examples might be, for example, love or education or contribution or service. And I think once we're able to connect with those and really define them and have a sense of like what they can look like in our lives, it can make a huge difference in just where our attention is.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. I think that was a beautiful answer, but something that I work on with clients in being able to identify values is having them identify their goals, like their goals for what it is that brought them to treatment, what they want to get out of treatment. I think you can find a lot of hidden values intertwined in goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think this is a great place to start. And we're starting to get some questions. So Matt and Jenny, I'm going to come back to your question because that's something I do want to get to. But first, I would love to start with the question at 719, which says, why do you think that OCD affects things we're so passionate about and value so much? It says, I agree with everything that Tom said. Is OCD trying to control everything we value and remove any uncertainty from these things that we deeply care about? And I think you hit the nail on the head with this because this really is our topic tonight. It's okay, we care about these things. OCD is latching on. OCD might be twisting them. So why do we think that might happen? Marisa, do you have any thoughts about why that might take place?
Well, similar to what Tom said earlier, like we're not anxious about things we don't genuinely care about, right? And OCD is wise in some ways in that it knows what is most important to the person, right? I think of some of the folks I work with, like postpartum OCD. What is the OCD attack? Like their brand new vulnerable baby, the thing that they love and cherish most in those moments. Right. And so it goes after what is most meaningful to that person. It sniffs that out like a bully would, and picks at it in all these different ways. And one way of kind of looking at the OCD is that it's almost like this like hyperactive monkey or hyperactive puppy, if you will, because I think in some ways, like it is trying to perhaps direct the person towards what matters to them. It's just on steroids, right? Like it's just doing it in this overly excited way.
I love what you said, because I forget who said this, but I was on a town hall with someone at some point who talked about, if you're struggling to figure out what your values are, figure out what your OCD is latching onto and kind of follow the rope back to that. And it's really interesting. And for folks listening, that's always been my experience. And it can be really confusing. I know Tom can speak to this, but I mean, my OCD for the most part has latched onto things related to my students, related to being a harmful person, related to my faith, related to being dangerous, related to my family. And if you went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many there are, those are the things that are really important to me. And generally we end up getting the question of like, oh, well, why can't I have that theme over there? That one doesn't seem, well, the reason you don't have that theme over there is it's not the one that really is significant and important to you. Yeah, go ahead, Callie.
I was going to say, I think sometimes too, you have to go a little bit further down the rope to see what the values are. And I think about my racing. Sometimes there was compulsions very specific to racing, like retying my shoes over and over to get to the starting line, to have that just right feeling. But oftentimes, I think what my OCD would say, you can't handle not knowing the outcome of that race. You can't handle not knowing if you're going to win or lose. So let's do all these harm OCD compulsions instead, like as a distraction, when really the value still was my racing. It was just a little bit more hidden behind different types of compulsions.
I love that, because it isn't always as clear as it looks. And I think that's really important to note and to point out too. So Tom, what does that look like? You mentioned this a little bit before, but what does this look like for you?
I think for me, it's been, like I said before, kind of a constant battle. I think, like Marisa and Cali have said, I think it attacks, it is tricky, right? It's like, OCD is wise, right? Marisa's right. Like it's not dumb. It attacks the things that you love because it knows it's going to get the most attention with those things. So I think for me, between ERP and ACT therapy, I think that's kind of been like the way of leaning into those values and making sure that those values are what are at the forefront of my mind, and they're not feeding the OCD, because once those values turn to compulsions, then they're no longer useful. And they're no longer something that is going to help us. And I think that's been a battle for me, is realizing that when I let OCD win, those values aren't values anymore. Those values are OCD's values. Like OCD takes them away, and I don't own those values anymore. So it's about kind of battling OCD and making sure that, they're still mine, and I know why I value those things.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of making sure that that OCD doesn't take those values from you, that they just get to still be yours. And that's really what I want to get into, of what happens when OCD makes us confused about what those values are to begin with. So for instance, one of the questions I get a lot, and even I'll actually say, even in my own life for a long time, I worried so much. I struggled really, really badly with kind of false memory and harm-related OCD.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved through a really long period of, well, what if I committed a crime and forgot about it? What if I'm actually this horrible person who is totally unworthy of being a chaplain and working with my students? Well, the interesting thing was the obsession for me made me question the value. So everyone would say, well, your value is your students, so get better for your students. And I would say, but what if that really isn't my value? Because what if I did something horrible? And it almost gets in this place of contradicting itself sometimes in our minds. So I wonder, how do we respond to that when it feels like the OCD takes it and flips it? Yeah, go ahead, Callie.
Yeah, I think that's answering Adam's question there.
Yeah, I was about to say, I could definitely speak to that one.
So I think what happens when we're super anxious, our insight goes out the window, is what I always say. Like when we feel that anxious, we don't know what the difference is, and it's very hard to make a choice. So one thing I tell patients, especially when we're in the midst of our OCD work, is it's not that we have to accept worst case scenario, and it's not that we have to accept best case scenario, because that's still accepting certainty, right? Like if you accept worst case scenario of, if you have harm OCD, I have to accept that I'm going to kill my loved one. That would be awful. You would never want to go back to treatment, and it would be debilitating. You'd probably lose hope. And so we really need to be able to accept that you know what, I'm going to roll the dice that this is OCD and I'm going to move forward. And that's how we kind of work towards taking the risk. But you just kind of have to remember, you're not taking the risk towards that worst case scenario, which is what I think people get confused on a lot.
Yeah, it's not this, and I think it, and that's really, I'll say, a big stuck point for me for such a long time. It was like, oh wait, so you're telling me I actually have to accept that I'm like this horrible person, and it's accepting the uncertainty, not accepting like the reality of the thing that you dread.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I would love to pull up Adam's question too, so we can speak to that more specifically, because I know we're kind of chatting about it. So Adam's question says, sometimes the compulsions feel so in line with my values, exercise, healthy eating, that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between what I want and what my disorder wants. Any advice on how to differentiate?
I think, I mean, I can start on this one. Obviously, Cali can jump in. I think for me, I mean, that's big for me. Obviously, I was in the college setting as a strength coach for 5 years, and now I'm a head strength coach at an athletic training facility. And obviously, I compete in weightlifting. So it's like, these are all things that are like, I'm very around exercise, and I'm consistently around, talking about preaching, sports nutrition to my athletes. And so I'm preaching all these things, and I believe in these things, right? And then when OCD kind of attacks those things that I value, it can get really dicey, because it's like, when is this OCD and when is it value? So I totally get what I'm saying. I know for me, what I realize is like, when it becomes an unhealthy obsession is when you realize that it's becoming OCD, and then it's becoming something that you need to attack in therapy, and make sure that you're giving a conscious effort to stop, because that means that the OCD is taking away that from the value, and it is becoming OCD. And it's very easy for it to fall into becoming a compulsion. I know for me, like with training, it's important for me to take off a day in between, like on a Wednesday, between Tuesday and Thursday, because it chops up that week of like training consecutively, and it keeps it so it's something I value, and I know that I need the rest to perform at my best. And then, the rest that day in between turns into, okay, I value, the work I'm putting in, and I value the hopeful outcome that I have. So to get there, I need to lean into those values and take the rest day, and not turn into an obsession where I need to train 5 days in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Cali. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I like what Tom was referring to about, like, he knows what patterns to recognize for himself. And I always think about, like, what are my red flags? Okay, well, one of my red flags is anytime I have a race coming up, I know I am more likely to have urges to do compulsions. And so when I was in college, I was doing 30 plus compulsions around the day of a race. And now my goal is to pick one thing that I knew the last time I kind of gave into compulsion wise, and say that I'm going to challenge it for this next race. And so also just knowing that we are still kind of sharpening the edges. Like Tom knows he needs to skip a day to sharpen his edges and stay on top of his values. And for me, I know I might need to stop my watch purposely on an odd number, or I need to make sure that I only tie my shoes once and roll the dice that's an OCD thing, and kind of still moving forward in that way. And I will say, oftentimes it is confusing, because it doesn't feel like you're moving towards your values when you take those risks, right? But I think it's good to remind yourself too that for so long, when OCD was debilitating, or if OCD is currently debilitating, you've been taking the risk that you thought this wasn't your values, and it's kept you in this cycle. So it's kind of like trusting and changing the pattern that you were previously engaging in.
Yeah. I like to like almost flip the script, like by doing this, by resisting the thoughts and the compulsions, like I'm actually flipping the script of, I'm leaning into my values more, because I know it's going to help me longer term.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go ahead, Marisa.
Yeah, one thing that I was going to mention too is sort of just checking in about what are the actual values underneath exercise and healthy eating, right? So for Cali, like, what about racing is important to you? Tom, like, what about that lifting is so important to you? Because usually the values that I hear from folks include something like, self-kindness or self-love or self-compassion. And oftentimes when I see this hijacking of values, it's because perfectionism is on board. It's not just OCD. There's also perfectionism on board. And I think it's really important to identify that early on in treatment, because it can really impact how the treatment looks from the get-go. And so a lot of what I do to kind of talk about perfectionism is, what perfectionism is the mind saying, either you or your experiences should be bigger, better, more, different in some way. Right. And if the person's able to connect with their values of maybe self-love or kindness or compassion, right, then they're also able to see, well, yeah, like exercise might be important to me because I want to nourish my body. And when we look at values, there's many different ways of nourishing our body. And perfectionism might say, well, you have to exercise 7 days a week for 2 hours, right? There's the perfectionism. I have to, right? You should be bigger, better, more. There's that pressure, physical pressure. Like I can feel it in my chest when I say I have to, I should, I must, right? And what we talk about is good enough, right? Good enough. Like what would good enough look like in this case? Because obviously exercising is important to you. It's bringing you closer to your values. And so is self-love.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And it's something that I've had to do in my own work is restructure what my value means to me, because it does get tied into that perfectionism. And so my value, or what I used to think my value was, which actually was pulling me more into the OCD anxiety trap, was winning and doing my very best and giving my body its all so that I could get some kind of result. And now my value is so much more geared towards long-term freedom and happiness, and success is defined differently, I think, than what it used to be for me. And it took a long way to get there, but to be able to say, well, like success for me now is not feeling burned out and enjoying this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfectionism is so outcome focused, right? I have to make X amount of money or get certain position in my job, or I have to win, right? And it's really interesting to me too to see folks. Sometimes when folks will initially do values exercise and then we work on perfectionism, they'll recognize themselves. Wait a second, that was the perfectionism talking when I picked success, right? And we talked about now, how would you redefine success? Mm-hmm. Because it's one thing to focus on the outcome, but how is it you're living throughout that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. And obviously, Cali, Tom, and I, it sounds like we all have a lot of experience in this. And I can relate to so much of that through school and through education and through athletics. And it's so interesting and similar to Cali with the athletic piece. For me, I shifted from really focusing on outcome driven running to being in a space right now where I'm running ultra marathons for OCD fundraisers for fun. And it's been a really bizarre shift for me that I'm not focusing on this particular racing outcome that I once was. And I think, collegiate athlete me would look at this and say like, oh, I can't believe you're not doing all of this stuff around times. And honestly, it's the most joyful and fulfilled that I've ever felt in it, because I'm just doing it in a space of self-compassion, not trying to do it perfectly. I'm giving myself space to take time off. So not to make it all about the athletic piece. I know there's a lot more here, but I think, it's really interesting. Like Marisa said, when we stop focusing on that outcome, that you actually get to enjoy the journey of kind of what those values look like and what they mean.
Right. Like what is the real prize here? Just kind of knowing for this next Olympic trials cycle that I'm trying to go to, the way that I am looking at it is so different from even the first one. And I was in a pretty good place overall with my OCD the first time, but there were still so many opportunities of growth around that. And I realized like there was still a lot of, well, you have to do this. What are people going to think if you don't? And this time, like, great if I make it, great if I don't. And I think that's too where people get confused of like, well, so you're just going to have the everybody gets a trophy mentality, because that's not really cool. But it's actually kind of trusting, you know what, like I know my body is going to go out there and do its best because that's how I'm wired. And so let that be enough. And the real win there for me is if I enjoy this process, because if it's meant to be, it'll be. And if it's not, it's not. But if I enjoyed it, then that's the hardest part. The work was put in and it pays off.
Yeah, definitely. I think, what I preach to athletes too is when they bring that kind of stuff to me, it's like, as long as you do everything you can in a healthy manner, right, and not in a perfectionist way, or and not letting OCD take over, but everything you can in a way that fits with your values, whatever the outcome is, you can't hang your head, right? So like for Cali, like you're doing everything you can to get to where you need to be, but if it doesn't happen, like you're gonna be bummed, like that's natural, but you're going to be able to live with it because you did everything in your power.
Yeah, go ahead, Marisa, and then I'm going to flip to a different question. This is such a great conversation.
Yeah, I felt like Cali brought up a really important point about trust, because I feel like when I know, although I don't have OCD, I've certainly struggled with general anxiety and perfectionism. And I know for myself, when I focus on good enough as a mom, as a therapist, immediately my mind, shows up and says, but you're going to fail. Like you're going to fail. Right. And so you brought up this concept of trust, which I've been, really kind of thinking about and soaking up in many different ways. And one of my meditation teachers actually recently said, trust your experience, not your mind. And I thought that was so important, right? Like, trust my experience, not my mind. Like, let's see if I can show up in a good enough way. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I love that, because as soon as you pointed out that I said that, I was thinking so many people on here are probably thinking, well, but I can't trust. My OCD takes that piece away. And so that is such a good quote for everyone to remember and take away.
I'm really excited. I just made a mental note of actually what time we said that, so I can go back and take a snippet of that too. And I'm so glad that you differentiated and that you brought that up. And I think for folks that are on here that hear us do some stuff around faith and OCD, we talk about that too. That there's kind of this element of trust. Also, I always talk about what it means to also have faith in yourself and faith in your treatment. Right. Of trusting this process that can seem really, really challenging, and that can seem totally in opposition to everything that your brain and your feelings and your emotions are telling you to do. But just, I think also trusting in that treatment becomes really important, and trusting that this all is that you're going to be able to do these things, and that you can get back to these values in ways that are meaningful. So that faith piece kind of brings me back actually to Matt and Jenny at 7:15. And this is a really awesome question. I'm really passionate about this. I do. It's funny because Stacy right above that talked about me doing peer support specialist stuff. I'm shifting full time into faith and OCD integrative specialist stuff starting in May. So I do a lot of work with clinicians and clients separating faith from OCD. And that's really Matt and Jenny's question. So it says, I'm interested in hearing about determining values while doing ERP for scrupulosity, specifically for someone like me who's not willing to give up my foundation of moral absolutes. So I'd love to start with this. This is what I do most of the time, honestly, now, is working with folks on what does it look like to determine values around faith when OCD might be saying one thing. And I think sometimes this can become really, really tricky, where it can feel like my faith is dictating that I do this thing in a particular way, or my faith is dictating that I do this perfectly, or my faith is dictating that I see God in this particular way, when actually a lot of times for folks who are coming for scrupulosity treatment, that might be the OCD. What I always tell folks is to look for what you feel like you have to do, or what you feel like you're doing out of fear, what you feel like you're doing out of obligation, versus what is bringing you joy, what's bringing you meaning, what you're actually drawn to as a part of that faith tradition. And if you're saying like, oh, I have to go and pray 12 times a day because something bad's going to happen if I don't, or because that's my moral obligation, probably OCD. But if you're saying, hey, I want to go and engage in this prayer or engage in this particular ritual because it brings me a lot of joy and because it brings me meaning, I think that's a space where we can separate. I think with the ERP, it can be really, really challenging. And we'll be talking about this a lot at the upcoming Iocdf Faith and OCD conference. Sometimes ERP around religious group can feel like, well, both religious and moral group can feel like you are opposing things that are really significant to you. Particularly when we're thinking about kind of the faith and the religion side, it can feel like, oh, how could I possibly do this? I feel like I'm going against my faith traditions. And what I always tell folks is you're not opposing your faith tradition. You're literally opposing the OCD so that you can get back to your faith in a way that's value driven. So I think that's a really important distinction when you feel like, oh, I'm not willing to give up this moral or this religious aspect. We're not asking you to. It's about doing these things so that you can get back to that in a value-driven way. I wonder, yeah, Cali, go ahead.
I mean, you said everything so perfectly. Those are all of the same ways I describe it too. One, like if a specific example might help, something that came to mind was like if I have an exposure for somebody that has so much fear around skipping reading the Bible one night because of a feeling that like I absolutely have to do this or else something bad will happen. We might have a short-term goal of skipping reading the Bible. And there might be this argument in the back of the head saying, but if you do that, like you're really stepping away from your faith. And I think we have to ask ourselves again, what are the long-term values? What are the long-term goals? Is it just like what Katie said? Am I trying to get joy and freedom and peace from what my faith is supposed to be bringing me? Or am I trying to be enslaved by this? So like if I get to make the choice every day to read my Bible in the future, that's awesome. But right now OCD is making that choice. And so I need to get back to that place of being able to be the one to make the choice. And so that might include an exposure of skipping a Bible and reading in the short term.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Cali, and to your point, it can seem so hard for that person. And yeah, I talk to folks in Christianity in this area, but also for folks who are listening who are Hindu and who are Muslim and who are Sikh. And any of those, it's really hard when you hear somebody say, hey, like, you're going to have to skip engaging in this, or hey, maybe you're going to have to say that prayer imperfectly. And I have people look at me like their eyes are popping out of their head, like, how could you possibly tell me to do that? Right? That has to be moving me away from my faith. And it's not. It's we're moving you away from the OCD. We're breaking you down from the OCD so you can get back to your faith in a value-driven way. And it loops back to everything else that we were kind of talking about with values of the whole point in this is to be able to do what's yours as opposed to the OCD taking those values, like Tom was saying.
I think an important thing is that I always think about is like, just like before what I said, like by combating those thoughts and working on, not giving into the OCD, it's actually going to get me more quality time in my faith instead of OCD riddled time in my faith. And I think that's like, there's a huge difference of being able to practice Christianity as a Christian, but then also just have OCD infiltrating it 24/7, or doing the hard work in the short term to give myself more peace and more actual quality time with Christ and with, building a faith connection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, go ahead, Marisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so important, and kind of linking it back to some of the perfectionism, right? Because I think it ties into, having to be a perfect, Christian or a perfect member of that religious society. And so one of the things that I've found helpful from consulting with different pastors and things like that is that most religions or spiritualities, like when you ask about the values of that religion, or it often includes something about forgiveness or love, right? And so, what would your God or your spiritual leader say about making mistakes, right? Like about failing, because, we all fail.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of being a human being. And the only thing we have control over is how we treat ourselves when we do fail.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know when that'll happen. This is where uncertainty lives. We don't know when or how we'll fail, right? We can't necessarily always control it, but we do have control over how we treat ourselves. And, you could consider, what are your religious beliefs around that? Like, what would your God or religion say about how to treat people that make mistakes, that fail?
I love that you brought that up. And the two pieces I always go back to theologically with folks and with clinicians is it's very similar to what you brought up. Like, one, most faith traditions believe that God is all powerful, all good, all loving, and all of those things. And I always tell folks, if you actually believe that God is all powerful and loving, then God can both handle you doing exposures and understands why you're doing those things, and would want you to do the things that you need to do to get better. And the other piece is, in believing in an all compassionate and an all loving God, what does it look like to see yourself through the same loving eyes that your creator sees you? And I think those are really powerful things to think about, where often our OCD says, no, we can't think about that. But if you actually go back to the core values of most faiths, like that's a really big component there of actually living into that. So moving from the faith piece, I love Amy at 726 says, when depression gets in between the OCD and values, one has difficulty doing anything. I know this can be really tough. So what's the best way to deal with both simultaneously? Any thoughts on this, Cali, Marisa, on maybe clients that you see that might be navigating this depression component too?
When I know depression can pull you back, it's again, I think Marisa, you can speak more to the values piece, but I think of the challenge of being kind of doing the opposite of what the depression is telling you, just kind of like we do when we challenge OCD. So depression will make you want to stay in bed, avoid the day. And if you can do just one thing, like if we look at the hierarchy approach, right, we're not asking you to go conquer the world, because that would be completely overwhelming. So I think just what's that one thing that you can do to take one step further than what you did the day before? Because before it becomes a pattern, before you start to feel that freedom, you do have to challenge it, and it's hard and it's difficult and sometimes painful. But kind of, if you're feeling like I'm going to lay in bed all day, or I need to lay in bed all day, and you do that, that's not challenging the depression. Or just like when you fully give into a compulsion instead of trying to take a step away from that compulsion, it's not challenging the OCD.
Thank you, Cali. Marisa, do you have anything to add to that with the depression or the values piece?
Yeah, one thing that I would ask is, what is the sadness trying to remind you of that's important to you? Right? What is the sadness trying to remind you of that's important to you? Right? We can think of, like, ACT is a transdiagnostic model. So it works for depression, it works for OCD as well. And I think the message that we've learned from ACT is that feelings can be kind of like messengers in some ways. If we're open to having them and connect with them, they can actually guide us and sometimes remind us of what really matters. Right? But in this case, the compulsion, if you will, is rumination. Right? So the question is, can I feel sad and still do the things that are important to me? Right? Can I try and notice when I'm ruminating and treat it like a mental compulsion? Right? Notice when I'm ruminating, and instead, can I focus on what's on the other side of that sadness? Right? What's meaningful to me? Can I still get up and, walk my dog, or get up and go to the gym and do the things that are important to me, even like while feeling sad?
Yeah, I always love the concept of acting as if, and really regard, and I try to live definitely not perfectly. And I'll say this has been a tougher OCD week for me. So I've struggled with this too, for folks who are on here, but trying to say, you know what, if I wasn't feeling this way, what are those things that I would be doing? And I love one of our national advocates, Ethan Smith, always says, and also my partner. So I guess I don't have to be super formal in saying that, but
I was like, are we just not gonna throw that in? Or I was like, wow,
well, we used to be really private about it.
She's amazing about being professional.
We used to be really private about it, but now kind of everybody, yeah. So it's fine. But he always talks about how at the end of the day, it's a good day, regardless of how he felt, just based on those things that he did. He's like, oh, I felt really junky today, but I got up and I went to work and I went for a walk and I did all these things. And you can get to the end of the day, and regardless of how you were feeling, you can be so excited that you made the choice to do all those things that were value driven and that were meaningful to you. Tom, it looked like you had something to say with that.
No, I just think that goes well with the, what you were saying with the self-compassion, and you and Marisa and Cali were saying with the self-compassion theme, about like, yeah, maybe you didn't accomplish everything you want in one day or everything you set out to do, but you still got up, you still got certain things done that that's where that self-compassion comes in, and that overall, like, you still challenged your OCD. And when it told you, today was when you knew, I know when I wake up, I know it's going to be a tough day, right? And like, it's just about learning how to endure that tough day. And you did that. So you should pat yourself on the back, and like, you shouldn't, be so hard on yourself all the time.
Yeah, I want to add to that too, if that's okay. And it ties into Alexandra's question a little bit and what Tom was just discussing. But when OCD is all consuming, I think if that's like the primary thing that's in the way, how can you know what it is that you want to address in normal everyday family life struggles? Or in kind of like, I always use the example of how can I know what I want to order on a menu at a restaurant when I am dealing with an OCD compulsion, right? Or a lot of OCD compulsions. And so just to kind of tie in other life problems or struggles unrelated to OCD, they are really difficult to address when we haven't tackled the thing that's primarily in the way, kind of like a big layer that we've got to be able to target. Doesn't mean we're going to get all of it, right? But it does have to be in a place where we can get some of that insight back.
I love that. Are there any final thoughts on this question? I'm going to shift. I've just realized a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try to start chiming into some of those. Go ahead, Marisa.
There's one thing I want to share that I recently heard, and it really stood out to me. It was about this psychologist talking about a totally different subject. But he was like, I wake up every morning and think to myself, if today was the last day on Earth, on this planet, how would I want to live today? Right? It's not so much like how would I want to feel today, because those feelings, like having anxiety, having depression, like all of that is so hard and oftentimes out of our control. Right? But we can focus on how we spend our time and remind ourselves that it's all temporary. Our emotions are temporary. Life is temporary. And so it's keeping this in mind that I think can really kind of inspire and motivate us of like, how do I actually want to live today, even with these feelings?
I love that. I really love that. And I think that's such a great thing for us to think about of really what does that actually look like? What does that mean for us? What do we want that to look like, regardless of how we're feeling? So thank you for that. So we have Grace at 7:34, and I want to bring this up as an advocacy piece too, and I think this is really great for folks to hear. Sorry, my thing scrolled down. I actually meant Grace at 7:29. Sorry, Grace at 7:29. I am currently in the Fire Academy, and I'm also an individual who lives with OCD, though currently struggling with OCD and daily obsessions and compulsions. The Fire Academy has taught me that it is through the very concept of values. For me, I value serving others and empathizing with those in vulnerable situations that I have been able to challenge OCD, because I have seen that the fulfillment of helping others greatly outweighs the discomfort of challenging the thoughts. I just thought that was so beautifully said. And Tom, you might have some thoughts on this too, and we can go ahead and pull it down because I don't want to cover up Marisa and Tom. But I just thought that was really beautiful. And I think for folks who are listening on here, at least for me, that's precisely the reason I advocate. I think that honestly, advocacy, this idea of helping others in their journey, it's really my reason for fighting OCD every day. I said that this week has been a tough week for me, or really today has been a really tough day for me with OCD. And my reason for, offering myself compassion, but trying to do the best I can to not engage in compulsions while moving towards my values is literally because of things like this, and knowing that I'm getting on this town hall tonight and wanting to practice the things that I preach, and wanting to have the energy and the health to be able to continue to support folks in this work. And I think advocacy, even all of you here in the chat asking questions and supporting one another, it can be such a great value and motivator. So Tom, I wonder if that speaks to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it just goes back to regular ERP for me, how I kind of challenge those compulsions regarding exercising. I think it was really just about making that hierarchy and just kind of not trying to go from 0 to 100 right immediately. Maybe the first thing that I did was skipping reps, or purposely skipping a rep, or purposely doing one less set. Just small changes. One thing that, and it kind of applies to everything in life, is success is kind of like, the way I always say how I measure success is and what it is created by is the sum of small efforts day in and day out. And so, that being said, I think those small efforts with ERP and with checking off that hierarchy, those accumulate over time, and you're able to do the bigger ones eventually. And it's like muscle memory. You start combating those thoughts while you're at the gym. Now it's easier to start tackling some of the bigger obstacles. So that's kind of how I operate with compulsions regarding exercising. I think it's honorable that you can realize the value of and the concept of challenging compulsions, because a lot of people can't even face them head on, because there's so much excruciating anxiety with them. So I think just for that, you need to give yourself a pat on the back and be self-compassionate there, and realize that you're already on your way, just even acknowledging them. But I really think success is definitely the sum of small efforts. So I think putting those small efforts day in, day out is going to pay off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cali, I wonder if you have any thoughts about Grace at 745 on how did you work on challenging compulsions regarding exercise?
Yeah, I did a lot of what Tom mentioned as well, kind of just I love to say I played a game with myself of like, let me challenge this. Okay, my OCD wants me to do this today, so I'm going to do this instead. And of course, it didn't feel like a game, right? It felt really hard. It wasn't fun. But even to this day, especially around a race coming up, I do have this tendency to want to go back and do a specific compulsion. And sometimes I pause and I even consider it for a little while. And sometimes I give into the compulsion. But it's really a matter of, okay, this one thing that I need to do right now is like I used to have to put the pins on my number up a certain way because it had to face towards God instead of towards hell, or I felt like I would lose the race. And so even to this day, when I put a number on, I have the urge to do the last two on top. And that's one little thing. And it takes, 30 seconds, but to give into that compulsion. But again, I'm constantly reminding myself, okay, but the long-term freedom is me doing this with the last one facing the bottom now and still going and running that race, because that's one step closer to what I need. So like what Tom said, these small little things add up to big successes. And I think it's the same with compulsions around exercise, right? If you feel like you have to do this certain thing, you know that if it's definite, I have to do this, that's not coming from you, right? That's not because you want to do that. That's because OCD is telling you to do that. And so it's really a matter of challenging it and I always love to say, putting yourself in the driver's seat. Like you want to be the one in control of that decision.
Thank you. Thank you, Cali and Tom, for that. I'm seeing a couple different questions on this. So just wanted to point out, so Uli at 7:45 asked, is there a link of a list of places you can get an evaluation, haven't been diagnosed for OCD? So I'd love, I think we'll have our awesome IOCDF team behind the scenes stick some resources in the chat. We have a whole list of clinicians through the IOCDF that are trained and that know OCD, that know evidence-based treatments for OCD, like exposure and response prevention, and like ACT. And we have Cali and Marisa on here tonight who treat OCD, but there are a lot of great folks in your area or that treat in your area that you can look for a local provider. So I would definitely try that. We have a ton of great resources on the IOCDF webpage and symptom checklists and things like that. But the best is always, of course, to go and to get evaluated by a licensed clinician. So just wanted to put that out there. Wanted to ask Mike at 7:45 says, how do you work with ASD and OCD? And I know we end up getting a lot of questions about autism spectrum disorder as well, a little bit different from our topic tonight, but I wonder, Cali and Marisa, if you have any thoughts or resources that you might share in that area. And if not, that's okay too.
I don't know, Cali, I'm not sure if you have more experience with this. I wouldn't say ASD is my specialty per se, but I have worked with a few people who experience ASD, and I think the main piece that I try and stick to is I'd probably work a little bit more behaviorally than I would with a client without ASD. And so I'm still focusing on things like values, but I try and do it in a little bit more of a concrete way. So I might focus on some of the behaviors that come from the value versus the vague and abstract value. And I think about one person in particular that I was working with ASD responded really well to like visual stimuli and rewards. And so this was a young adult, and we were able to create a reward chart, and he loved it because he was able to see it in a very concrete way and give himself rewards, and he was rewarded by his family for doing those kinds of behaviors. And so and for him, he wanted to earn some money to be able to do things like go to the movies. And so that was we used that as the carrot. It was being independent. I saw it as the value. But what we really focused on in the sessions was getting that movie money. And each time he stood up to the OCD, he was able to get closer to what he wanted.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you, Marisa. I have worked with some cases, but I wouldn't say I specialize in ASD. And with a case I think of in particularly, same thing. We had a reward system that we worked towards. And I think the way I look at it is the goals are broken down a little bit smaller. Not because of anything in particular, just because I think the short-term goals are better motivation when ASD comes into place at times than those long-term goals. They can feel a little bit more overwhelming. And then also sometimes with rituals in ASD, it's a little bit more of a, sometimes like it's like they feel like I can enjoy this, or ego dystonic. Or did I say that correctly? Ego dystonic. Syntonic.
I'm not the person to ask, sorry guys.
Yeah. Ego syntonic. So meaning that sometimes there can be a little bit of joy and pleasure from some of the rituals. And so just a lot of education around that, maybe spending more time on the education than you would without the ASD component.
Thank you all so much for addressing that. And I know that I think for folks who don't specialize in that, those were awesome answers. But I know that to the resource page that we just put up, we do have some awesome folks affiliated with the IOCDF who also do specialize in autism spectrum disorders. And if you have questions that we weren't that we didn't get to or answer tonight, along with that or anything else, we'll give you some space at the end of where you can reach out, and we can make sure you get the resources that you need. So looping back to really that values piece, and this connects to something we said earlier at 7:53, Kay says, now the obsession is not perfectionism, but the fear that I cannot achieve good enough or even be average. Do you have any additional suggestions for adapting ERP? And this loops back into what we were talking about earlier. And I wonder, Marisa, this is kind of going back to what you were talking about with that good enough piece, if you have any thoughts.
So the fear is that I cannot achieve good enough or even be average. And so, what I might say to the OCD in that scenario is, let's see, right? Like, what about trying and taking the risk of failing is important to you? Right. And kind of leaning into that, like, what about possibly failing and taking risks are important to you? What's the value underneath that? And can we try and see for ourselves, right? Like, you don't actually know what you're capable of unless you try. It's hard. It's so scary. It's hard. And the mind can be really, 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 really convincing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what you're capable of until we try.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marisa. And I love that you're able to address that, because it's coming back to that piece that you really brought up for us earlier. So thank you. So I want to go to Tim at 757. Actually, Tim at 755 is where it starts. Sorry, Tim at 755 is wondering how you manage and maintain a relationship while having ROCD. So for folks who don't know, ROCD is relationship OCD, and I think this piece kind of comes up for folks a lot with values too, because their values might have to do with the way that they connect, the way that they love and care about family or about a partner. And sometimes this can get really twisted with OCD as well, of, well, do I really love and care about my partner? Do they really love and care about me? What does this mean? What does this look like? Am I really attracted to them? There's all these different questions that come up that can still in some ways be tied back to values, but in an interesting way. So I wonder, Cali, do you have any thoughts on the ROCD piece and values?
Yeah, I think it really is a lot like what we do with the other subtypes of OCD too, right? We're kind of taking the risk there that this is an OCD thing, and it feels scary and it feels real. But we know that when we are struggling with an OCD thought, there is this pattern, right? We're overthinking, we're overanalyzing. It doesn't feel good. A value would be to try to be present in your relationship with your partner. And so if you are not present and you are overanalyzing, we kind of assume that that's probably giving into a compulsion. And so what can you do to bring yourself back to being present? And that is taking the risk that you might not solve that certainty answer that you're trying to solve, and being with that person in that moment and trying to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Tom, you're nodding. I feel like you might have thoughts about that too. Do you have any thoughts around this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I just know personally, I definitely deal with ROCD, and every single thought is always about, are we gonna last? Like, does she really love me? That kind of stuff. And it's very value based. And so, one thing that it's like it's actually like probably one of the hardest obsessions for me to combat, because it's one of those, what my therapist calls like one of the very realistic ones, right? And when they're very realistic, they're a lot more troublesome and a little bit more tricky, because it's realistic. So you'd rather just, not take the chance. And so for me, leaning into the values of, what my relationship is built on, and that trust and that love that we have for each other, that's been the kind of the driving force of combating that, the OCD thoughts and the ROCD thoughts is looking back on what our relationship together values, and then leaning on those values that we built together.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for sharing that. I know that's really personal too, and I can relate to those things that attach to values. It always seems real, right? Like, it seems so real and so tangible and just so palatable. And like, how could I possibly risk this thing? And I think with OCD, we end up in this place of it feels like you are giving everything up by sitting with that uncertainty because it feels so real, when in reality you end up actually having a choice between moving towards the OCD and moving towards that value that is your relationship. But it's like flipped from what it actually feels like in that moment. And that can be really, really hard.
Definitely.
So yeah, go ahead, Marisa.
I was just saying, yeah, and I was sort of thinking about noticing those moments where perhaps you can even recall a memory in your life where you have, experienced something like joy or something close to joy, and just noticing what was happening in that moment, right? Like, what were you focused on? Where was your attention? What were you doing? And just noticing like the freedom that came with being kind of in that moment. Because oftentimes it's those joyous moments that we're actually not focused on internal experiences, right? Like, we're not focused in here or what's happening in here. We're completely thrown into the moment, right? Like noticing what's happening in front of me, smelling things, hearing things, seeing things. Like, that's kind of what we're focused on oftentimes in those moments. And in those moments, it often feels very freeing. And that's what I hear from folks is like, letting go of control is extremely frightening. And yet, once they're willing to slowly take that risk, they also kind of talk about just how freeing it can be.
Yeah, something to add on to what Marisa just said from a personal perspective of putting that into practice myself. I have had moments where I would get stuck and then think about the time I was stuck with a thought similarly and how I was able to push through it. And I would find that I would get to a place where I was enjoying something, right? Like where I had let go of trying to solve the thought. And we know that that's what we're supposed to do regarding OCD, right? We're supposed to push forward. We're not supposed to solve. We're supposed to lean into uncertainty. But it's not really until you have done it that you can kind of get the confidence to be able to do it again. And so it's like a little bit of an epiphany there of, oh yeah, I did do that. And so, okay, like I am going to let myself play this board game and not try to solve that answer. And then you can get the freedom and build that confidence so that it becomes easier to do it, just like any other exposure.
Yeah, Callie, I'm so glad you brought up that personal piece, and I relate to this. And I think it feels so hard though, right? Like, so for me, and I'll say every time it's like, well, okay, but if I just get the answer about this one thing, if I just get this certainty, like this one time, then I can like enjoy my life and it'll be fine. Then I can accept uncertainty all the rest of the times. But it really is, it's so interesting that when you're able to actually lean into it, as hard as that is at the beginning, that I've learned this too, half the time I'll actually kind of wake up and find myself enjoying something and forgetting the fact that I was trying to lean into uncertainty. And it's so interesting that as soon as you stop trying to get rid of the thoughts and as soon as you stop trying to feel better, which is kind of, it feels like such a mind game. So many folks say like, well, when will I actually feel better? Well, when you stop trying to feel better, right? It's when you actually are okay with feeling like this and having these thoughts and these feelings, then you wake up and are kind of enjoying what you're doing. And going back to the choice piece that Marisa said too, and I'm curious what y'all think about this. I love the element of choice and thinking about what we have choices in and what we don't have choices in. And I think it's so fascinating that we can't choose the fact that we have OCD. We can't choose our thoughts. We can't choose our emotions, but we can choose how we respond. We can choose to not engage in compulsions. We can choose to move towards our values. But I think with so many folks, and I'll speak for me, we try to flip it, right? Like, we're like, oh, I can't control doing this compulsion, but I'm going to try to control the fact that I have OCD. I'm going to try to get rid of my thoughts. I'm going to try to get rid of my emotions. But the stuff that we can actually control is the stuff we forget we can. Does that make sense? Do y'all resonate with that in any way?
Yeah.
So I think that ends up being a big piece too. Yeah, go, Callie, you look like you had something to say with that.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say that, yeah, I definitely agree. And it's not until we are able to get a breakthrough that we can kind of trust it again and move forward with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So hold on for the breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I hope Lauren, I hope you heard this, Lauren at 802, and we can't see sometimes the full questions when it gets really long, so it cut off a little bit, but it says, I've become very depressed and feel physically sad and hopeless because of OCD. I've been dealing with these feelings specifically for months, and after spending some time at McLean in Boston, I got myself to get out of bed every day in an ACT mindset, which is awesome. But it seems the sadness is persistent no matter what. I have recently begun to lose steam and forcing myself to go through the day and spending a lot of time in bed, have been having a lot of existential dread, and it cuts off on our end. But I think it sounds like what you're experiencing is, yes, you're living into all of those things that you know to do and that you've been through treatment. And there's still this feeling of, like, why aren't I feeling better? And why am I still going through this dread? And first of all, I'm so sorry that you're feeling like that. I know Tom's nodding because I think we've been there.
Yeah, I just know exactly what she's feeling. You know what I mean? It's like I know exactly the feeling. It's the worst.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it makes you angry. It makes you sad. It makes you upset. It's like, why? And I know I've been there so many times of like feeling like, well, those other people can get better, but I can't. What's wrong with me that I can't get to that place? So I wonder, Cali and Marisa, do you have words of wisdom for folks that you might find in that place, or words of hope?
Yeah, I was speaking to someone about this not too long ago because their answer was, well, if I could just move to a private island and be by myself, then I wouldn't have this problem. Or if I could just, and they were kind of just living in this mindset of if I could, instead of being present and working towards the freedom. And so I think the most important thing is you have to have hope in order to be able to respond to the therapy, right? And like, we know that the hope is, like, as therapists, we wouldn't tell you to have that hope if we didn't think it was possible. And so to be able to say, like, to yourself, it's not going to be like this forever because I am going to take the right steps, is going to give you that sense of hope, because you have to have it to have motivation, and you have to have motivation to be able to do the ERP. So I think knowing that, just like what Tom says, he and myself and probably so many others listening have been in this exact same position, and it feels like there is no end to it, but there is, and it's one step at a time, right? So like something that I did when I was really struggling, kind of at my worst, I remember thinking, well, there's no way I'll ever be able to get married or do these other things in life that I did have goals for before my OCD took over and became debilitating. And so one of my exposures was, like, I call it a bittersweet exposure. I had to make a Pinterest wedding board of like things that I would have at my wedding, but just something as small as that was anxiety provoking. But it also gave me just enough hope to say, but maybe I can do this, because we don't want an absolute, because again, that gets into the distorted thinking patterns and takes away from the hope that you need.
Cali, I love that. And that's such a tangible thing too, of being able to say, like, I can see this and I can feel this and I can move towards this. I much simpler than what Cali is saying. A lot of times I'll do an arrow for myself or with folks that I work with, and I'll put kind of OCD on one end and whatever that thing that I want to move towards on the other end, or something that's really meaningful, which can be really simple. That might even mean hanging out with my grandparents or doing something that makes me smile, and thinking about every time those things come up, do I want to take a step towards this side or a step towards this side, and just making it that simple of, I can take a step towards this, even if this feels really hard. Yeah, go ahead, Marisa. I can tell you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, like, as I said earlier, maybe getting a little curious about this sadness, right? Like, what might this sadness be trying to remind you of that's important to you? And I love what Tom said earlier about like small steps. Like, what's something itty bitty? Like, I don't care how small it is. What's something itty bitty that I can do differently tomorrow? And like, I mean, the fact that you're here and on watching Town Hall really does speak to your resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
right? Knowing that you're not alone. It's one thing to suffer and feel alone in it. It's another to suffer and be connected in it. And the fact that you're doing this is awesome. And what I want to say is, you know, coming out of a program like McLean, where you get all of this support, to sometimes folks will just go to like 1 hour a week sessions. That's a big difference, right? And so, you know, one thing I often encourage people to think about as they're getting out of, you know, intensive programs or IOPs is what is it you're really needing, right? And sometimes it's just more support. Maybe it's a support group, or maybe it's to meet with a therapist more than once a week. Because oftentimes these programs can be like 25, 35 hours a week, and then you're only going down to one. That would be hard for anyone. And sometimes when things are hard, it's not a reflection of us. It just means we need something different, whether it's more support or a different kind of support. And so that's kind of what comes up for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Marisa. And thanks for, I hope that folks heard that. And Lauren, I hope that you heard that compassion in that note, that the fact that you're here, and the fact that you've navigated treatment and wherever you are, that you are enough, and that you are not alone in this journey. So I want to do one final question, and then we'll do wrap up thoughts too. But this is, I think, a great last question at 8:04. And it kind of comes back to the whole kind of point of this talk to begin with. And it's from Starboy, and it says, any advice on what to do when the core of the OCD attacks all your values, and then you can't really find your values since they're ruined by the OCD? And we've hit on this in some different ways. This is really why I wanted to bring this up tonight, because I think it can get kind of tricky. So I wonder, I'll kind of make this a free for all, because this is our last one. So if anybody wants to jump in on this one, go ahead.
Something that, oh,
I guess
I was
just do a free for all. Okay, go ahead, Callie.
I was just going to say the one thing that comes to mind, short and simple, is what did you used to love? Like, if it's gotten to a point where everything is so blurry and it's really hard to differentiate and see what's something that used to bring you joy, and kind of work towards that in regards to facing and challenging the fears.
Thank you. Go ahead, Marisa.
What I might say is feelings first. It's really hard to sort of navigate decisions when we're in that sympathetic state, right? We're not going to be more rational about what our values are and things like that. So I might suggest actually doing an exposure. Like, what's the worst case scenario if your values are ruined by the OCD? And what would be the hardest part of that, right? And maybe try, nipping it with an exposure first, and then see what you're left with.
I love that. I think, and Tom, I don't know about you, I can relate to this question a lot, just like a lot of the questions that we've had tonight, because it becomes tricky. It feels like, well, okay, I value my students, or I value my family, but my OCD is attacking that. So how could I possibly value that if it's twisted in my mind? How could I think about harming my family if I value my family? And it's because you do value your family, but it can get really, really confusing in what that means and what that looks like. So I love bringing back in that exposure piece, and knowing that we have these skills and tools to be able to navigate the OCD and still move towards the values in a meaningful, value-driven way. Values in a value-driven way, all the things. So I would love to just give a minute for everybody, if you have closing thoughts around this topic on determining your values when OCD attacks your values, or anything we've chatted about tonight. And I'll go to you, Tom. Any closing words for our folks tonight?
I think this closing words would be that obviously you value, self-improvement and battling the OCD if you're here. So give yourself a pat on the back for that, and understand that you're leaning into your values by being here. Mm-hmm. So I'm very proud of you guys, of everybody that's here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. Marisa, closing thoughts on values, determining your values, all the things.
I mean, you were just like brought up the whole self-compassion piece. And I think, one of the things I pull from mindful self-compassion is we're all deserving of love and kindness. and that even exposures can be done in a loving, kind way. So thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think, oh gosh, I want to have a whole nother town hall now on that. I think that's a really important piece that we forget sometimes. Thank you. And Cali, closing thoughts tonight.
So something I said in a podcast a while back about competing and how OCD took away my love for running for such a long time was life is too short to let stress and routine take the passion out of something you were once passionate about. So don't let it steal your spark. And I just feel like that's really in line with the values piece today. And so it's scary getting those values back, but so worth it. And so many of us have done it time and time again with exposures, and you can too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And yeah, and I'll just close before so stick around, please don't jump off yet. We have some announcements of awesome programming that's happening the rest of the week, but I'll just say, in light for me of being authentic and saying tonight that it's been a tough week for me around moral scrutiny and some things that haven't come up for me in a while, due to some kind of unexpected triggers. And I think that's important for folks to note that happens. Like I have OCD. I expect that to happen. And you can still be in recovery and make the choices to live a beautiful, awesome, value-driven life. Right. But I think for me, the thing that's prevented me from going down the rabbit hole of compulsions has really been this values piece, and thinking about even next week, I get to spend time with my mom, who I don't often get to see, who is navigating cancer and navigating some things in her own life. I get to see my grandparents next week. And honestly, for me, thinking about family, and thinking about, okay, yeah, you know what? All the scary stuff could come true, but I'm willing to risk all of that coming true for a chance to be present with my family and with the people that I care so much about next week. And that still feels really scary. And I want folks to know that for me today, that felt like, it felt awful. It felt scary, but it's also worth it. When I get on the phone and I hear my mom say, like, I'm so excited to see you next week. Your grandpa is so excited to see you next week. It's worth it for me to take that risk that all the bad, scary stuff could come true for a chance at that beautiful life that I want with my family, that's value driven and that's meaningful. And I hope that you all are able to find that piece for you of what you want to move towards, and what you are willing to risk all the scary stuff for a chance at being able to claim. So just in closing out tonight, I just want to note that this live stream is one of many. We have live streams all the time. So you can view the entire live stream schedule and submit topics and questions for future live streams at iocdf.org/peace of mind. And we check that and we make sure that we get back to y'all. So please feel free to do that. You can watch live, or you can also view recordings on IOCDF's YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages, as well as at iocdf.org/live. For the rest of the week, we have tomorrow's programming. So tomorrow, March 2nd, we have our Ask the Experts live stream at 12 p.m. Eastern with IOCDF advocates and clinicians, Liz McInvale and Chris Tronson. So please submit your questions for these two ahead of time at iocdf.org/peace of mind. And I feel like I want to jump up and down for this next announcement because I'm so excited about it. Today, the IOCDF launched registration for our Faith and OCD conference happening May 9th. This is our second annual, and there's been a lot of awesome effort going into this. And I'll just say, we have so much great programming for clinicians and for faith leaders and for individuals with OCD. And we even have some things that are specific to different faiths. So please go ahead over there and sign up, and we would love to have you. It's an inclusive space where all are welcome to come and share their experience, but also to hear from others as we seek to bridge the gap between faith and mental health. And then finally, please remember to like and subscribe to get notified when live streams are scheduled. And if we didn't get to your question, or if you have a suggestion for a future topic you'd like to see covered, once again, please go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to submit these. And know that if you need any resources that you can visit iocdf.org. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. We had such great questions in the chat. We have some awesome folks behind the scenes. So thank you so much to Heather and to Skyla with the Iocdf for doing all of their magic. And Cali, Tom, and Marisa, thank you for bringing so much love to everyone in our chat tonight and everyone that I know will watch after. So we hope that you all go out and live into your values as you seek to really claim those beautiful lives that you both desire and deserve. We'll see you next time.